helping with technical issues, but so far you guys have been doing amazing, so that's great. I'm going to start by saying I'd like to recognize that Thompson Rivers University campuses are on the traditional land of the Kamloops to Shepwuk Kamloops campus and the Texalk Williams Lake campus, with the Shepwuk Lukwa, the traditional and unceded territory of the Shepwuk. The region of TRU also serves and it extends into the territories of the Statnimk, the Nekakamuk, the Chilcotin, the Nawak, and the Dakwa. Thompson Rivers University, with their partners, holds an annual webinar series. So this is the first of the series, and also provides courses dedicated to providing relevant technical information, resources, and tools for small water system operators and owners and First Nations small water systems on issues of treatment, regulation, operations, maintenance, and water quality monitoring. At the same time, we're hoping to provide a forum for systems to share information, and we are trying to build a good community around the small water operators in BC. So we welcome you today. The Online Help Center strives to assist all small water systems in BC to implement a multi-barrier approach to drinking water in order for systems to consistently provide safe, potable drinking water to their communities in compliance with government regulations. Today's webinar and all the webinars in the series this year will be worth 0.1 CEU towards a certificate for those who are EOCP certified operators. These webinars will be held once every 2 months, and if you were on the website, you'll see they're all posted and you can register for them at any time. For those who do count this towards their CEU, a certificate of completion will be issued to your email when you're finished the webinar. So it should be out within 1 to 2 hours of the completion of this webinar. Please check your junk mail. We cannot reissue certificates. The system we're using doesn't allow for that. So please check your junk mail if you didn't get one. And now we're ready to get to the good part. Today's webinar. Today we have 2 presenters. We're really grateful for Marta Green and John Pogson to join us today. Marta is going to start with her presentation on protecting source water and the importance of source water protection plans. She will share her insights and experience on why source protection plans matter to drinking water system owners, the steps that go into a source protection plan, and some tips to help water system owners build and implement their own source protection plan. This webinar will include some recent case studies, including how the City of Merritt's source protection plan helped the city in their drinking water system recovery efforts after the devastating floods in November of 2021. And the webinar will also provide an opportunity for Q&A discussion on emerging source water protection concerns for water systems. You will notice all attendees are on mute. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat question section at the bottom of your GoTo control panel. We would ask that everyone hold questions until the end of the presentation. So that includes John's presentation. So we will answer all questions at the end of the presentation. We will take questions in queue as they're entered into the chat. Okay, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Marta in a second.
Thanks, Natasha.
You're welcome.
And yeah, as we get our slide deck going here, I just thought if folks wanted to put where they're from in the chat, that would help me understand our audience, where you're coming from. And if you've got some sort of source protection plan or some sort of tasks related to source protection planning that you're currently working on, that would be awesome. All right, how's that look?
Looks good. I'm going to go on mute now and let you take over.
Okay. Great, yeah. My good friend Rob Birtles from Interior Health invited me here, and I'm excited to help launch the 2022 webinar series. As Natasha mentioned, I'll be talking about source protection plans and their importance in protecting source water. And hot off the press, I have some neat photos pre and post flood there that hopefully will help reinforce the message. And yeah, I hope you'll enjoy this and it's useful for you. All right, so from this session, we will hopefully discuss what is a source protection plan, why are they important, how to do them, and some key takeaways as the operators and owners. And hopefully by the end of the presentation, you may know why these two photos here get me really excited. All right, so what is a source protection plan? So the source protection plan is the document that identifies hazards to the source water and recommends actions to improve the protection to the source. So it's important to remember that while this is a document that, my worst fear is it collects dust on people's shelves, I think the process of going through how to write a source protection plan is also a pretty useful process. Every time I've helped and been involved with doing a source protection plan, I've always found at least one thing that is an opportunity for improvement. And what I'm most excited about, though, is seeing all the different people come together that have a role to play in protecting source water. All right, so why do a source protection plan? So Justice O'Connor led the inquiry into the Walkerton disaster way back in 2002, and one of his conclusions was the first barrier to the contamination of drinking water involves protecting the sources of the drinking water. As Natasha mentioned, all small water systems in BC operate under the concept of a multi-barrier approach. And so in water treatment, if you're lucky to have water treatment as part of your system, remember your treatment plant is only designed to treat whatever is the parameter it's been designed for. So if you have a hydrocarbon spill or if you have a mouse that has died down on the outside of the casing, your treatment may not be suitable to manage that. Yeah, why else? It's really good for a guidance document to help you with the planning of your water system for the future, for understanding what capital investments you might need to make. It really covers not just opportunities to improve the source water itself, but perhaps you might realize that there is a hazard that is out there, but you don't own the land, you don't own the business, and so you have very little control over if something is spilt or whatnot, but maybe what you do have control over is beefing up your emergency response plan. So a source protection plan may or may not be an actual requirement. Right now, there is no direct requirement under the Drinking Water Protection Regulation in BC for all water systems to have a source protection plan. You do need to write an emergency response plan. And I can't quite figure out how you do an emergency response plan until you've done your drinking water safety plan or your source to tap plan, or at a minimum, your source water protection plan. Another kind of neat thing about source protection plans is it is the story. It helps you frame where your water comes from. It helps you get out there in front of the public and start talking about where your water comes from. There's very few watersheds that are completely closed. Pretty much the bulk majority, except for maybe Metro Vancouver and Capital Regional District, have a multi-use watershed, meaning there's multiple users in your watershed. And finally, I think it really helps you with your resiliency in a changing climate. And as we'll be able to talk about, you basically go through and see the vulnerable points from a climate perspective, because all water doesn't just come out of a tap, it comes out of a watershed or an aquifer. So really, with a changing climate, it's even more important to understand about your source water. So steps to a source protection plan. Unfortunately, there isn't the perfect guide out there for small water systems. On the right, top right, is the Comprehensive Drinking Water Source to Tap, written by Ministry of Health. It's definitely the most comprehensive, but it's also pretty intimidating for small water system owners. What I like about it is it has a risk matrix, which the Well Protection Toolkit on the lower does not have. Another kind of in the middle, more perfect for smaller systems is the First Nations On Reserve Source Water Protection Plan. And it also has the risk matrix. So in general, if you boil it all down, these are the main steps of a source protection plan. So you set up a working committee. These are the people that are very familiar with the system, but also people that might be familiar with some hazards in the source watershed, and also people that might be able to help you protect the source water into the future. And this often is community water groups, or people that are pretty excited and keen on environmental issues in the community. The next step is to delineate the assessment area or your capture zone. We'll go through that. And then you identify hazards within those areas. You rank your hazards according to risk, and then you come up with your recommended actions. So we'll go through each of these steps using the case study from the City of Merritt. So as I mentioned, this is a step definitely worth taking some time. I think it was a few years ago now that I did the City of Merritt's source protection plan, and we really focused on having members from the city specifically. We had the operator, we had public works superintendent, we had an administrator, and we had their city planner. We also had the drinking water officer from Interior Health, the large water system, but we didn't actually have too much involvement from the community or an industry rep or the province, although we did link those in later. So the next step is to map out the watershed or the well capture zone. So if you have a surface water intake, it's the watershed or the contributing watershed that you're mapping out. Again, there isn't like one perfect guide out there, but the comprehensive source to tap suggests a 100-meter radius around your intake would be your intake protection zone, which I'm calling zone number 1. And that's obviously because it's the area that's most vulnerable, being the closest. And then there is no set standard for your next area or your intake protection zone 2. In this module, I think this was from the First Nations module, it suggested anywhere where you have 2 hours before that contaminant will arrive at your intake. Now, that's a pretty challenging study to do. You need to do wind studies and all sorts of different technical studies. So there are some more easy ways to provide yourself with an area that's a reasonable capture zone or watershed assessment area. For example, if you're on a lake and there's an obvious peninsula or bay area, that's probably a reasonable IPZ2. I'm a hydrogeologist, so this is kind of more my comfort area. So here we're worried about well capture zones. We do also follow this 100-meter concept for the near wellhead protection zone. Then what I typically recommend is a 2-year. This means that any rain and snow melt will be carrying within this zone will be carrying anything they pick up and travel to the well within a 2-year time of travel. Going farther out, I suggest using a 5-year or a 25-year. The reason I've chosen these is for the 2-year, that's typically the time within which your pathogens, your viruses, and your protozoa will die off. A 5-year is a reasonable kind of time of travel for most chemical hazards, because they should be cleaned up or bioremediated if they're outside of that. And then only the most persistent would I go with, like a 25-year time of travel. All right, so there are different methods to do the, your well capture zones. In this method, we followed the calculated fixed radius method, which is available in the Well Protection Toolkit, which is produced by the BC Groundwater Association. Anyways, you just need to understand a little bit about your aquifer properties, your hydraulic conductivity, and your pumping rate. So not too crazy to estimate. So here you can see in red is the 100-meter well protection zone around, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 wells. For this purpose, we chose a 200-day capture zone because that's the BC Ministry of Health's guideline for groundwater risk of containing pathogens. And then we did a 10-year time of travel because we felt we didn't have enough information for a 25-year time of travel capture zone. So if you have wells that are close by, you can see sometimes the zones merge, which is fine. At the end of the day, you want this to be an easy tool to use for communicating how fast and how far away can contaminants move towards a well. All right, so after you've delineated your assessment areas, then it's a really good idea to describe your sources. So get to know your sources. This is a really good activity to do anyways, just to start kind of considering in a changing climate, or with, for example, a flood or an extreme precip event, rain on snow event, how vulnerable is your infrastructure? So for example, here we can see the Vote Park number 2 well has a screened interval that's much shallower than the other wells. So that might be the most vulnerable well in their well system. All right, so then you go and start identifying hazards within these capture zones. So how do you do this? You do this through your working committee. So you might have someone familiar with the neighborhood. We use the Contaminated Sites Registry to pull some anywhere where there might have been a remediation or contamination event documented. We'll look at zoning. We'll do a windshield survey, driving around, that kind of thing. So you gather all of your hazards, and then you just put them into a simple table where you describe the owner, the distance to source, the contaminants of concern, and the the transport mechanism. So is it going to be entering the well from the well head, going directly down the well or along the outside of the casing and then through the screen, or is it coming through infiltration and then natural groundwater flow? Right, so this is, I think, one of the most important steps of a source protection plan, because up until now you have a whole bunch of different hazards, and how do you know what to do with them, and how do you rank your priorities? So this is where the risk ranking comes in, and some of you may have seen these before. They're pretty typical matrix to figure out what's a higher priority or not. So on the left is the likelihood that that contaminant will arrive at your intake or at your well. So not that that contaminant exists, but if that contaminant can travel from where it exists to the intake or to the inside of the well. So you do need to understand quite a bit about how your contaminant travels, either in your surface water or your lake setting, for example, or through your aquifer. So you need to know a little bit about chemistry and a little bit about your hydrology or your hydrogeology. And then on the top, you've got the magnitude of consequence. So if that contaminant arrives at the well, what does that mean to you? So for example, if you only had one well or one intake and you have a hydrocarbon contamination event that reaches your intake or your well, and you have no backup, that is catastrophic. That is a complete failure of the water system. So you go ahead and with your working committee, you work together to rank the risk level. And for here, you can see how we then took the hazards and moved them and sorted them by the risk level. And the nice thing with this is then it's all of a sudden not so daunting. A lot of the risks you realize are pretty low chance that they will arrive at the well, and a low consequence if they do arrive. For example, if it's sodium and you have lots of malls that use salt as part of their winter road maintenance plan, but you know you just need to continue to monitor and work with the mall owner, that's a pretty low consequence level. So from there, now you've got all of your hazards ranked. You understand about your wells, and it's time to start thinking about actions. So I've developed this kind of diagram here just to describe all the players and the types of actions that can go into protecting your source water and resulting in safer drinking water. So in the nucleus, you have your city infrastructure and management improvements. So these are things that the city themselves can control. If you're on a groundwater system, your wells are probably in city-owned parks or areas. So, and if you also happen to own the wastewater system, you have a lot more control over your source water than you think. If you are on a surface water intake, well, you probably have a license to take water from the Crown land, and you probably don't have nearly as much control over the watershed. So that's why I've shown these rings that go out from the core that kind of explain what you could do next. You could engage with other public agencies and industries. You could do work with community groups and do some public awareness campaigns. And at the highest ring is just this general kind of advocacy for improved legislation. So yeah, so here I've just gotten some examples of some actions that were identified. One action could be inspecting these are actual action items from the City of Merritt's. One is inspecting pump houses regularly for vandalism and for preferred pathways. I've seen a lot of construction around pump houses, and it's strange that people don't realize that that's the actual water that they're drinking. So if I'm an operator, water system owner, I'd be very protective of my well or the pump house and really watch who comes on my property. And sometimes they just leave jerry cans or oil drums around. They might not realize the chances, they might not realize that they're basically standing on top of the water supply. I've seen some really funny things with people backfilling with pea gravel. Remember the next rain or snow melt event, all of that water will go directly into the ground, and when the pump turns on, it could be sucked up into the well. Yeah, so the City of Merritt's fortunate that they own all of their own wastewater infrastructure as well. So they can really, it's the same people, so they can really work on prioritizing inspections of the sanitary sewers within the Aquifer Protection Area A, like that area immediately within 100 meters of the wells. And then they can obviously, there's a pretty common one, start sampling for a comprehensive list of analytes once a year, or perhaps you might want to do it quarterly, and start reviewing emergency response plans and think about redundancy a little bit. We'll talk about that in a sec here. Other actions are, this is a chance you can start communicating with the public. There's a lot of agriculture around, there's a lot of mechanic shops or that type of thing that people do around downtown Merritt. And so this is a really good opportunity to kind of just start having those conversations. There's a lot more protection that a local government has than they might think they have under their official community plan and bylaws. I'm not an expert in this, but this is definitely something that I'm super interested in. And I know the Okanagan Basin Water Board have been doing some awesome work. And yeah, I would work with the planning department, and you can develop these development permit areas for groundwater protection, and you could start managing better the land use around your wells. And of course, start sharing the plan with first responders, and in this case, Merit, obviously having a highway running through, working with the Ministry of Transportation Infrastructure. Yeah, so I just have some nice photos here, and I would love to share them with you. They get me pretty excited. All right, so the first kind of takeaway that I really sunk in with being a first responder after the City of Merritt's flood on November 15th. I was there on day 6, and my goal was to confirm or assess that the aquifer is still safe to drink before they take off the do not consume order. So the first takeaway is really trust the multi-barrier approach. So yes, you might have a filtration plant or you might have chlorine, but that treatment plant is designed for a specific turbidity, a specific type of source water quality. And so in extreme weather, or if you haven't managed your source water well, you could have some crazy water coming through. So I really am a true believer on this multiple barrier approach. If you can be doing a little bit of something in every of these buckets, I think you'll be in good shape. I guess I don't know if I have another photo, so I'll just talk about why I'm so excited about this. This was like pretty much the only opportunity for improvement I found around as far as like the operators at Merit when I went in to do their source protection plan. They ran a really tight ship, really experienced managers that really care, or operators that really care about their water source. And I found one tiny opening. I think this is some sort of data logger that goes down probably to measure water level on top of their pump. And so it was open. And so one of my recommendations was just to use some silicone to cover that up. Their air valve goes out the top, so we don't have to worry about causing suction on top of the pump. And so post-flood, I went and I inspected every single pump house for this gap here, and I was very excited to see that they did have some silicone underneath. And when the flood went through the pump houses, the actual well, inside of the well, was not impacted whatsoever. So that made me very excited. Yeah, the next takeaway I thought that the City of Merritt had done a really good job at is they had incredible redundancy and resiliency. They have 1, 2, 3, 4 well fields. 3 of them were impacted. The flood ran right by and through each of the pump houses. But all of their wells were raised a little bit above, and so the water, I guess the water might have run across, but the wells were sealed. So the flood basically went through, and they were able to basically rely on the one well they had outside of the flood impacted area until we did our checking and our testing on the other wells. But really they were, except for one well pump house that had an electrical issue and was too low down, they were able to take their water samples, and as soon as Interior Health gave them the nod, they were able to turn them back on. Know your sources. Yeah, so as part of the post-flood risk review, I quickly drew up some cross sections. There was some scouring, as you can see. Some of you may recognize Lori, one of my favorite people, the Groundwater Protection Officer out of the Kamloops office. There was some scouring, right? So if you don't understand how groundwater systems work, or you don't understand where your well intake there's a lot of panic that happens in a flood situation. And so our job was to go in there with confidence and give them the answers they needed, so they could check something off their very, very long to-do list. And so I just quickly drew up some cross sections. This was their most vulnerable well that I showed the well details on with the screen, top of screen at 9.8 meters, which is and it's a very long screen. I haven't seen one that long before. The later wells were deeper to give them additional available drawdown. But still, you still have the scouring happened here, even though it looked like a big deal, you know, taller than Lori. I was able to show through the cross section, you know, pictures worth 1,000 words, that there actually was no change to the conceptual model of groundwater flow for these wells. And in fact, there's still a ton of filtration that happens, and rain and snow melt happens all the time in Merritt, and they've never had turbid water, and so there would be no reason to have anything different after flood. Have all your documents in one spot. When I do my source protection plans, I assume they will be used, the first responders will use them. And so I always have all the well logs nicely labeled in an appendix. So these are the types of things that ended up being really useful for us when we were working with Interior Health to get the city back onto removing their do not consume and their boil water advisory. So we looked at pre-water quality data. So if you have it in a database, that would be great. But if not, that's okay, as long as you've got access to your pre-flood data. Well logs were super important, cross sections, and photos or as-built of your infrastructure and your pump house was all stuff we used. So just some photos here. There was some scouring, as I had talked about, at each, on the outside at each of the pump houses in the impacted area. The flood did go right through the pump houses, but as you can tell, the actual wellhead itself is up higher, and there was zero way for floodwater to enter. Unfortunately, I think this was the one where the electrical was impacted, but even the electrical and all the other wells were okay. So yeah, what's happened since? There's still lots of work to be done. We're still doing sampling because the 200-day, which is a seven-month time of travel, pretty much the full capture zone was inundated. So we will be continuing to take samples to make sure that our conceptual model of groundwater flow is still the case. This is where the water breached its banks to the Vote Park wells that you just saw there through this scouring and right over top too. So they are, I'm sure these are just temporary replacement of the berm until they do a proper design. Yeah, so what can operators do to help the source protection planning process? So yeah, definitely get yourself on that working committee and have all of your water quality and reports available to the technical team. If you haven't done one yet, there is lots of funding. Well, I don't know about lots, but I think there is some funding. You can talk to your environmental health officer if you're interested, or your regional hydrogeologist. There's some COVID relief and some watershed security funds that I think are going to be available pretty quick here. You could also start growing your network, finding those active community members that really can be your eyes and ears out there in the source watershed, and can maybe have some really good ideas around the action items. Yeah, and I think there's incredible opportunity working with your planning department to develop some of those bylaws that we talked about. Yeah, of course, any changes in water quality could be an indication of a trend in your source water, so definitely document any concerns in your logbook. In particular, around extreme weather events, what I'm very curious about is water quality after a rain on snow event, which I have a feeling we're going to be having a lot more of. So I'd be definitely documenting any turbidity or complaints that you've had after those types of weather events. I would definitely start sampling and have a really good pre-disaster water quality database. Those are pretty important. Yeah, definitely, I'm sure you already do, but continue to do your inspections and yeah, keep a good housekeeping around your wells. And you can start a plan yourself and you can practice your emergency response. So as far as a guide and template, I think this one is the best for small water systems. So if you just Google that, you can find it. And yeah, in summary, we talked about what is a source protection plan, why hopefully I've convinced you to do one, some of the basic steps that go into a source protection plan. We gave that case study, and we talked about what you as the operators can do. I'd like to acknowledge Kevin Vilak and his crew at the City of Merritt, and Lori Lyons on the photo on the left, she's on the right. That's always been super active in the Merritt area. So I think, Natasha, that's my last slide. And thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Marta. That was great. I'm just going to remind the audience to hold your questions, but you can feel free to start typing them into the chat whenever you want as we prepare for the next speaker, and we will get to them in queue afterwards. Thank you so much, Marta. That was wonderful. Our next speaker today is John. Let me just grab my John Pogson, and he is a hydrogeologist and the acting section head for the South Area Groundwater Science Team with the Ministry of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development, with a great acronym of FLNRORD, based in Penticton, BC. Mr. Pogson has experience and expertise in aquifer testing, contaminated site hydrogeology, and remediation. John has 28 years of experience working on groundwater and contaminated sites projects in BC, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories. He is going to talk today on the topic of flood protection for water supply wells, statutory requirements for flood protection of water supply wells under the Water Sustainability Act, and Groundwater Protection Regulation and groundwater flooding. So it works quite well. John, I'm going to hand over the presentation to you now.
Great.
Let's see. There we go.
Okay, I think I'll just do one more thing, and I believe we'll be ready to go. Natasha, how does that look?
That looks great.
Fabulous. Great. Well, let's start by firstly, thanks Rob for the invite, the opportunity to share with you today, all of you today, and also TRU, and Marta for that excellent presentation. I think it really demystifies something that seems quite daunting. So thank you so much for that. I am going to talk about groundwater and flooding. My name is John Pogson. I'm a hydrogeologist. I work with the Ministry of Forest, Lands and Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. And I am the acting section head, as Natasha described, for the South Area Groundwater Science Team, where we do groundwater science projects. We're trying to improve the knowledge of groundwater in the area, also supporting authorizations and also compliance and enforcement of the Groundwater Protection Regulation. A little aggressive there. Okay, so yeah, the objectives for today's presentation, we'll talk about the differences between surface and groundwater flooding. We'll understand the mechanisms of groundwater flooding, why it occurs. We'll talk about your statutory responsibilities for flood protection under the Groundwater Protection Regulation and the Act, and there's some others, so they are intertwined. And we'll just see how those help to reduce your risk of flooding to water supply wells. So before we dive in, I think when we usually think of flooding, these are the sorts of images we usually think of. We think of rivers scouring the banks, piling up debris, toppling infrastructure into those streams. This is from near Grand Forks. We also think of rivers overtopping their banks and flooding houses beyond. This is a picture I took from my old neighborhood in Calgary back in the 2013 flood, so just down the street from my house. And we also think of images like these where you have these brown murky waters inundating the floodplain or inundating streets and causing havoc. So those are all quite common to us. We've seen them all before, and those are typically one of two kinds. They're a pluvial flooding or riverine flooding. The pluvial flooding or rain flooding is really broken down into two kind of sections. You can talk about surface water flood. That's an extreme rainfall event. The important thing is that you don't really need a water body nearby. It's independent of having a body of water nearby. These typically occur more slowly. There's time to evacuate if that's a necessity. Nonetheless, the damage can be quite significant. And then a perhaps more accelerated version of the same is the flash flood, and that's a rapid torrent of water. It comes on very, very quickly, and the danger is obvious from the speed and also the destructive force of water and often entrained debris. And events like these atmospheric rivers are certainly types of events that could create this flash flood, and also geography. The other type of flooding that we commonly see is the fluvial or river flooding. This is usually from, again, a snowmelt or heavy rainfall event. You end up with water levels rising or the stage rising within a river or a lake. And then you see that overflowing of the banks to what would otherwise be dry land, or maybe damage to dikes or protective features like dams, and then ending up with swamping of or flooding of back areas. So those are the more common types of flooding, and those are risks that we generally understand. We've long recognized them. We have land use policies in place. There's hazard mapping and floodplain mapping. Insurance companies have risk assessments. We build structures to mitigate against these risks. And then the one thing that might sort of tip the apple cart is obviously climate change, forcing us to maybe reassess about some of those risks. That said, groundwater flooding is something that's perhaps a little bit less well understood. So when we talk about groundwater flooding, there are a bunch of different definitions out there. This one is the inundation of subsurface structures by groundwater without a necessary rise of the water table to the ground surface. Other definitions like this one from Floodwise BC, it speaks to an actual bring of the water pushing up to the surface. So whether it goes to the surface or not, what we're seeing is a uncharacteristic rise in groundwater levels. So with that, why do they rise? Well, there are a few reasons. I'll give you two, actually I'll give you three. First is you have excess recharge to an aquifer that already has a low storage capacity. The other is propagation into the aquifer due to that rising river stage or from the rising lake stage. And then this last one, which is perhaps a little less common, is a reduction in artificial storage. So you can imagine if you've got an area that has been pumped for a long time and you've created this artificial storage space, if you were to stop pumping and that storage were to fill naturally, then you would have a reduction. There may have been land use decisions made based on that lower water table. So let's talk about the first two there, because they're the more common ones. So recharge to an aquifer with low storage. This is typically an extreme precipitation or snowmelt event that will trigger that. You have high infiltration into the ground, and you may have started with an elevated groundwater level prior to the rain event. They can be somewhat delayed or protracted. It may not happen within hours. It's more days to weeks after that precipitation event. The effects can last a long time, and it's not necessarily restricted to the valley bottom. It really depends on geology. You can have emergence from hillsides, and it can actually impact soil stability on those hillsides. They can also be quite damaging, obviously, to underground structures, and they can create surface flooding if that water were to come to surface. And unfortunately, these risks are not quite as easily mapped, though there have been some attempts. The second type that we'll talk about is that propagation due to rising river stage. So as that river stage rises, water moves from the river out into the adjacent high conductivity aquifer. And as that happens, you end up with this increase in water levels and a decrease in available storage. And that can also happen if you're talking about an alluvial fan where you have those losses out into the coarse grained sediments. So that's sometimes a difficult concept to visualize. So this is a great little diagram from Barlow and Leake. What it shows is on the left, you've got a gaining stream. And so this is a condition where the groundwater levels adjacent to the stream are higher in head than the stream itself. So this can happen at any time of the year. We have rivers with gaining and losing reaches. This is a common situation in late summer in BC, for example, when base flow is supported predominantly by groundwater. And then on the right, this is more the condition that I was hoping to describe. So you've got a condition where the river level is higher than that of the coarse grained sediments that are adjacent to the stream. And then you have a head differential where you have the surface water that actually leaks out and goes into those coarse grained sediments or in the groundwater adjacent to the stream. So I'll give you an example of that. This is taken from that Abood, Kathy Ryan's group out of the University of Calgary, a paper that they did on the 2013 flood in Calgary. So it's a really good example, and I think it's applicable to here in a lot of British Columbia, where you've got this scoured out bedrock, you've got an aquifer in a bucket of sand and gravel, you've got a stream that probably runs down the fallwag of that valley, and then at normal levels, so level A, or stage A, you've got a river that's, you know, in pretty good harmony with groundwater in the adjacent coarse grained sediments of the alluvial aquifer. But as that stage rises to, say, a stage B, now you've got a house off on the right there that's at risk of flooding underground, not at surface. And then if you look off far to the left, there's that low area that where you could have groundwater surfacing quite some distance from that high stream flow. And then as we get to more extreme event, like the stage C, where you might have flooding that overbanks or comes very close to overbanking the river channel, then you have risks to flooding at that house on the left, and also maybe that low area just to the left of the house. So that's sort of all the main stages you might imagine in this situation. So the important thing to note is groundwater flooding doesn't necessarily require surface water flooding, though they may be in concert with each other. But commonly you're looking at aquifers that have coarse grained sediments adjacent to the stream. Importantly, these kinds of impacts, they can extend beyond what we think of as the mapped flood plain or flood zone, and the damage is typically to underground structures. So if you have wells and pits, basements, those sorts of things, that's where you would typically see that damage. Levees and berms may not prevent these impacts. You've probably seen images where you've got folks with sandbags and the water levels are quite high and the soil beyond is saturated, and that's a similar kind of a situation, something that's easy to view. The risks are not very easily mapped again. And groundwater flooding isn't something that's really talked about all that much. I did find a few articles. There's one from Chilliwack from a couple of years ago. I thought this was a nice colloquial way of describing it, is that it can creep up into homes from the bottom. And this is another picture from the 2013 flood in Calgary, where it was strictly groundwater flooding. And this is a distance away from the actual surface flooding. So I grabbed a couple of examples of groundwater levels relating to extreme weather events from the storm that we had last November. So we had the atmospheric river come through in November. And this is an example from Merritt, where we have an observation well, 296. It's sort of centrally located between the Coldwater and Nicola rivers, sort of somewhat in the middle of Merritt. I'll just kind of orient, there's a lot going on in this particular slide. So I'll just orient you. You've got the location here. You can see the hydrograph at the bottom is the actual observation well data. The top right, you can see the hydrograph from the actual Coldwater River. And then this middle photo shows some of the inundation that occurred when the river's overbanked. So what I wanted to draw your attention to was how quickly the groundwater rose during this event. So this is a rise of approximately 1 meter or just slightly more than a meter, and that occurred in about 2 days. So, and it can happen quite quickly in these cases, and it could take some time for it to dissipate. I do apologize that this data set is not complete, but I will show you one where you can see that in a little more detail. So this is from Hope. Similarly, an observation well, it's not especially deep, hydraulically connected to the stream. And you can see in this case, you can see that first spike in the hydrograph here. That is, again, a rise that occurred in about 2 days. But interestingly, this was a significant rise of just over 3 meters. And then it took the better part of maybe a week and a half, or not quite, maybe 10 days. And then we did get another blast of that atmospheric river, and you can see that response happening again over a couple of days. It took more or less a month to get back to what we'd expect to be seasonal norms. So the effects can be kind of long lasting. So I just wanted to touch on a few things with respect to mitigating those flood impacts. The Groundwater Protection Regulation does provide a few requirements that do suit that task. And Marta had some really good examples of how, if you do follow the regulations, these recommendations, well, the regulations, then it can have really positive outcomes, as she showed with that one pump house that got flooded and was still fairly well protected from infiltration, from direct infiltration. So yeah, we've got the primary one there, which is maintaining the integrity of your surface seal. That's going to mitigate against contaminated waters having a direct pathway down to your screen and ultimately into your system. Maintaining a stick-up, like Marta showed. If that stick-up is maintained, then even if you do have a certain degree of flooding, it's unlikely to overtop the well. And then if it were to come up that high, more than that 30 centimeters or 12 inches, you've got the requirement for a well cap or cover that prevents or precludes the entry of floodwater or foreign matter. There's other regulations, they're all quite intertwined. There's the Drinking Water Protection Regulation, there's GARP assessments, and the Health Hazard Reg, all kind of speak to this sort of flood protection requirement. So I'll just sum it up there with the following. So groundwater flooding is due to a groundwater table rise. Excess infiltration into the aquifer with low storage is one mechanism. The other is propagation from a stream into those coarse-grained sediments adjacent to the stream. The end impacts can reach well beyond your mapped flood zone, and flood proofing is extremely important. So by properly siting, constructing, maintaining your well, you can mitigate against the entrance of foreign matter into your well. Marta showed a few resources there. These are a few resources that that we have access to. Groundwater level interactive map. If you do have a provincial observation well in your area, you can obtain real-time or nearly real-time groundwater level data from the interactive map. The River Forecast Center is an excellent resource for flood and drought information. If you have questions about the Groundwater Protection Regulation, you can find a link there. And some communities have groundwater monitoring programs, though most of the time they're not real time, so they may give you some historical information, but probably not real time data. I've just included a few references if folks want to read up on some of these sources. This is where I got some of this information. This first paper in particular was, I thought, an interesting desktop study assessing the floods from the 2013 Calgary flood. And with that, I'll just say thank you very much for the opportunity, and I guess we'll go to questions.
Thanks so much, John. That was another great presentation. They played off each other very well. I would have thought that you guys planned that together. Maybe you did. We do have some questions, so we're gonna. So again, if you have questions for John, please put them into the questions, the chat, and I've got a few here, so I'm just gonna start back to Marta. I'm gonna make you presenter again. Is that okay?
Sure.
We'll see what we see, just so that you have center stage here. And I'm just gonna paste, I'm not sure what people see here. So I've got the first question from John Francis, and I'm just going to paste it in here for everyone. With the increase in events, are there new recommended timeline for testing chemical?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, great question. And we're learning every day too. Yeah, new recommended timeframe. I would love to see, instead of just doing a quarterly sample event, I would love to see people start taking samples after extreme weather. So yeah, if you do quarterly right now, if you can time it to take one when times are normal and then when times are not normal. So right now, if you've got rain on snow, this would be probably a really exciting time, exciting from understanding your water source perspective. Yeah, this would be a really great time. Yeah, so timing your sampling to happen within a few days or a week or a month of freshet, and then again, yeah, during normal season. So at least twice a year, I would say, if you can get up to 4, but don't worry about sampling at the exact same time. Maybe do some different sampling and we don't, like as John said, we don't know how long it takes for that groundwater level to rise or how long it takes for that first snow melt to flush into the aquifer. If you're in a sand and gravel aquifer, groundwater can move pretty fast, like a meter a day. So if you're sampling within a week of your rain on snow event, that would probably be sufficient, something like that. Good question.
Yes, thank you. I realize as we're going through these questions that perhaps they could be answered by either you or John. So I don't know, John, if you wanted to add anything to that answer, or should we move on to the next question?
No, we should move on to the next question.
Okay.
Thanks though.
Just gonna paste this in here. Do small water groups need an actual hydrogeologist to scope out our systems?
I can take that one. Yeah, Roger, good question. I don't think so. So I don't think so. If you're in BC, you could probably work with your drinking water officer, and maybe someone like John would be kind enough to join your working committee. Also, the closer your contaminant is to the well in general, that's the more risky contaminant. So I would just, at a minimum, go with the 100-meter circle. If everyone did that and focused on the 100 meters, closest 100 meters to your well, and focused on what hazards are in that area, you're probably going to get the bulk of the higher risk hazards. But I would love to help you if you feel free to contact me.
Okay. Next question. In the village of Lions Bay, BC, we use surface water from two creeks, Harvey and Magnesia. Are you planning to present how to protect surface water? It's a great question.
Yeah, so surface water, it's the exact same procedure as for groundwater. So that source to tap guideline from the Ministry of Health is a really good one, and it has a very good example of how to outline or delineate your contributing watersheds. So the trick with surface water is you don't own the land around your intake as you would if you're a groundwater water system owner. And so you are definitely more reliant on the concentric rings I showed in that one slide there. So it's a lot more about community engagement, partnerships with, for example, we've had success working with BC rec sites and trails. I don't know what ministry that'll be in now, John. So there, the Crown, the province does manage Crown land on behalf of the citizens of BC, and they do have people that have been involved with source protection plans, and they've done a really good job. For example, building proper hiking trails and outhouses so people do their business in a suitable place. So yeah, it is the same general concept, the same risk ranking, the same working committee as I presented there.
Thank you. Another question for Marta. Were there any major concerns about the November flooding in Merritt with regards to source protection? Any alterations the people there had to implement to deal with the abnormal water conditions? Were you consulted about how they might act in that situation?
Yeah, super devastating. Yeah, my heart goes out to everyone still being impacted. Of course, there are major concerns. Interior Health is the regulator, and they work closely with the city to first get them off a do not consume order and then off the boil water notice. And so I did have a role there to help them understand what were the contaminants of concern. And so we basically use the source to tap. We use the source protection and the source to tap concepts. So we re-looked at, we followed the exact same process. So what are the hazards present? The hazards that were present were all the same hazards that were there pre-flood. The flood did inundate the full 200-day time of travel capture zone that I showed. But because we understood the majority of groundwater in the Merritt setting was coming from a losing stream setting that John talked about, kilometers up gradient, and there's an amazing filtration that happens just naturally in a groundwater system. We weren't worried about any new contaminants that the groundwater system wasn't already kind of managing. And then we looked at the likelihood of occurrence. So we understand what hazards were present, were there any new hazards present? And then we looked at the risk ranking. So we looked through the likelihood of occurrence and the negative consequence, obviously, if there was water in the well, if there was flood water in the well, it's already happened. And so we went through the same process. We went through inspecting the wells, and yeah, we made sure we took a lot of samples, and we did the process of going through, and we had several recommendations that they were working through. So yeah, alterations. Yeah, so they definitely were really lucky in that they had multiple wells. So they closed down some wells. Some wells are still closed. They were able to switch to their farther away wells. Going forward, we're going to obviously look at the pump buildings themselves, and going forward, we're going to be looking at even raising the casing even more, making sure the air valve is way above the 200-year flood, making sure all the electrical equipment is in the above the 200-year flood. Yeah, so every situation is different, but groundwater in general is actually a very well protected water source in times of flood. We're even working on projects where we are intentionally putting wells in floodplains because that's where they get the best water quantity, and then we're going to just focus on having the treatment there so that they assume it's going to be treated to surface water quality, but as far as the electrical and all of that, allow the flood to pass by the well.
Awesome, thank you. Another question, this I think is for John. What risks do forest fires pose to both surface and groundwater sources?
Well, I think the most common risk is going to be you've lost that ability for uptake, for storage of that water, or interception of that water. So that's going to be probably your main. So it's going to be that probably more the surface runoff issues associated with fire. It's going to be your most common, I would expect.
And I think there's another webinar on fires coming up in the series.
Yeah, I think there is. Yeah, that's another big, it is a big topic in itself, isn't it? Okay. Another question for Marta. What information do you wish water suppliers had to help you with a GARP assessment?
Well logs. Well logs, even if they're from like older than me, some of them, they're like actually better drafted than some of the well logs we have today. So definitely your well logs. Any, great question, by the way. Any water chemistry that's more than just your E. coli total coliform sampling, so comprehensive sometimes it's called. Yeah, if you have your log books, if you've noticed any changes in water quality or trends and you've been jotting that down. As-builts are great, going into the details around the construction, around the actual physical well itself, and any improvements. It's incredible how a well used to be just one pipe and down and one pipe across, and now somehow, well, pump houses are like a spaghetti of pipes, which always is scary to me. Those would be my top three. Yeah, that would be amazing if you had all that.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Very succinct. Another question. I'm not sure who this one is for. Whitecroft Village water users 8 kilometers downstream of Sun Peaks. I think that's where they're from. Well depth is 152 feet. Major forest fire in July 2021. Is there any risk from the use of fire retardant? I think maybe this is for John.
I think, well, obviously it's a deep well. It really depends on what your hydraulic connection is to that potential contaminant source, right? It's a fate and transport question. I'm sorry, I can't give you too much more than that. But if you've got any contaminant, whether it's hydrocarbons or retardants, if you've got a pathway to that well, then you increase that risk, right?
Yeah, just to expand on that, John, I think definitely take a full nitrogen package. So nitrates can sometimes be one of the chemicals that are used in the that chemical, that red stuff. So yeah, get a full comprehensive test, including the full nitrogen package. So total nitrogen, nitrate, nitrite, organic, nitrogen, ammonia, and then you'll be able to check.
Awesome. I thought that worked well with, I had another question come in. What are some of the most common chemical contaminants of concern you've seen in BC? Were they naturally occurring or human caused?
Yeah, good question. Nitrates, I would say, I wrote some notes because I saw that come in earlier. Nitrates for sure is if you are in an area where people have their own septic fields, I would say nitrates are very persistent in our aquifers. So I would definitely sample again for the full nitrogen package there. Viruses and protozoa, we do see, especially if there's been some preferred pathways or some digging around the wellhead, and those can kill you fast, whereas nitrates will are more longer term. So I really would, if you haven't done your groundwater at risk of containing pathogens assessment, I would definitely encourage you to do that. Sodium is something I'm definitely keeping my eye on with winter road maintenance around here in the interior. With a lot of, I guess with the warming climate, we have a lot more temperatures around zero, and so there's a lot of sodium that people put on their sidewalks and roads, and just clumps of it. And sodium actually has a pretty low Health Canada guideline for sodium restricted diets. And this has been a big problem in Ontario, and I would say it's the #1 source protection issue in Ontario. Their aquifers are a little bit more vulnerable than ours, but they can basically work with a mall owner and get them on a winter road maintenance strategy and see a market decline in their sodium concentrations. So that's definitely something that's on my radar. Hydrocarbons are everywhere, and some of them have a very low detectable limit, and so that's something that I really start tracking, encourage people to start tracking. So it's the PAHs, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, pyrene and benzoypyrene. That type of group I find is quite ubiquitous, and so they can be detectable and still safe, but it's good to start at least tracking that to make sure it's not rising.
That was great. Is anyone taking notes? Another chemical question. Tasking a small water supply system operator with frequent chemical analysis could be cost prohibitive. What would be a reasonable testing frequency and conclusion duration after a chemical spill within 100 meters of a drilled well in soil of unknown characteristics? How is one to know the likely time of entry to the aquifer?
Good question. Yeah. I mean, a good rule of thumb is like that 1 meter a day for if you've got a sand and gravel aquifer. That would be a fast moving system. So if you're 100 meters away, it's going to be at least 3 months till that plume could pass your well. So yeah, if you've got a spill and you're trying to monitor on that time frame, yeah, I would probably do every 3 months for 1 year to start, and see if you're getting any trends through those 4 samples and reassess frequency at that time.
Okay, and one more technical question for John. Can groundwater flooding cause increased risk of bacterial contamination of a well due to the rise in the water table?
Could it? Yes, because you could be mobilizing contaminants that were otherwise not in connection with that water table. But I would say that if you've been doing your source protection and you've gone through that GARP assessment, you are going to arm yourself with a lot more protection against that eventuality.
Okay. Thank you. We've had a couple of less technical questions. Is there any other technical questions? You've got like 2 great technical resources right here. So I'll monitor for that. In the meantime, we have a reminder that the next webinar is the one on wildfires. So we will get into that topic in May. And also whether the PowerPoint slides will be available. So John and Marta, that's up to you. We can talk to you afterwards. I can confirm that we have recorded the session and we will be posting the recording on the Small Water Systems website. So you can rewatch it and remind yourself of the details there. I think, is that everything? I do have, okay, great. John said he can make the slides available. We can just post them as a PDF for download.
Yeah,
Just
for sure.
wonderful resources, guys. Thank you so much. We've had some good feedback that this has been a good webinar. So thanks to everyone who attended. Thanks very much to our presenters for the time they took today and the work they put into their presentations. They're great. As I said, the video will be available. We do have one question about just some contact information about hydrogeologists. I just wanted to acknowledge one person asked about that. So I will get back to individuals. I don't have all the information. So part of the point of these webinars, before I let everybody go, is to start generating this community and talking to each other. So yes, please ask these questions. If there's questions that come up afterwards, I'm just going to, you've seen this before. Please email us. And we will do our best to answer your questions, to put you in contact with who you need to. That is part of the purpose of this website and this community. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time today and for being a great technical audience and making life really easy for me. All right. I'm gonna wrap up then, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Natasha.
everybody.
Thank you.